Recently, I've been having a discussion about whether or not someone can lose salvation. Once you're redeemed by Jesus, can you lose your redemption? Can you no longer be sort of washed in the blood? And I've grown to believe that there's a few passages or books in the Bible, in the New Testament, that do believe this and advocate this, that you can lose your salvation, you can apostatize. And I heard an argument recently about one of those passages that I've really been thinking about. It's got my wheels turning. And so this is a chance to talk about that. The passage in question is Colossians 1:23. Just going to read it for a second. And then, of course, all verses in this whole document that I'm reading from, all of these are in the ESV, just if you're curious. And then all of this is also linked below if you want to look at it. Colossians 1:23, quote, "And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." When you read that passage where it says, he'll present you holy and blameless and above reproach if indeed you continue in the faith, or even to swap those to make it a bit more clear on the if then and say, if indeed you continue in the faith, you'll be presented as holy and blameless and above reproach. The way that reads in the plain text is that it's conditional, that if you do this, you will get this. And the implication there is that if you do not do this thing, if you do not continue in the faith, you may not be presented as holy and blameless and above reproach. And so if you go with this plain text reading of the text, it kind of sounds like it could be talking about a case where you could lose your salvation, where you could have it and then no longer have it. And so that's why this verse is the one contended. And I've heard a new argument for it now that I'm curious about and I want to focus on, that involves arguing that this isn't a case of potentially losing salvation, and it all focuses on that verb there when it says continue in if indeed you continue. The verb for continue has three main traits that we're going to focus on, and you can see where I'm finding this. I'm going to the Greek Interlinear on Bible Hub for Colossians 1:23, and you can find the verb for continue here, and you can hover over this little descriptor, and it tells you what you need to know, or the basics about that Greek verb. So you can see it's a verb, it's in the present indicative active, and it's in the second person plural. We're going to focus on that middle section there, the present indicative active. The verb for continue has those three main traits. It's in the present tense, it's in the indicative mood, and it's in the active voice. Now, from everything I've heard and read, nobody really cares in the context of this discussion about the fact that it's in the present tense and the active voice. Those don't really have a bearing on the interpretation in terms of salvation. Present tense in Greek mostly just means that an action is ongoing or continuous. That's the general meaning. And then the active voice just means that the subject of the sentence is the one completing the action that the verb is referencing. So those that are being presented as holy and blameless, the congregation that Paul's writing to, assumedly, they are the ones that would be doing the continuing in the faith that the verb is talking about. The verb meaning trait that's in contention here is that indicative mood of the passage. The argument is that the use of the indicative mood communicates that Paul views the continuing of the Colossians as a certainty. I'm going to read from a couple different Greek, sort of learning guides here. Study Smarter says, the indicative mood in Greek is a grammatical mood used to state facts and ask questions. It's the most commonly used mood in Greek, employing a range of tenses such as present, past, and future to express reality as opposed to possibility or necessity. And then good old Wikipedia says, the indicative is the form of the verb used for ordinary statements of fact. Looking at Precept Austin's website, they have a mood reference guide for the different moods a verb can be in. And you can see indicative is the mood that they signify is a statement of fact. And then you have others. So you have subjunctive, which is a possibility, a purpose. Optative, which is a wish or potential. And imperative, which is a command. I should also say here, should have said at the beginning, I don't know Greek. I don't know any Greek at all. So everything I'm saying here, I'm relying on what other people, have said in the past. And that's a huge caveat. If I knew Greek, I could say all of this with a lot more gusto. But yeah, so if you were indicating something that was uncertain, it seems like indicative is not the mood you'd use. You'd use, subjunctive or optative. If the indicative mood is used by things that are statements of fact, as of speculation or potential, then the use of this mood by Paul may indicate that he views that continuing of the faith by the Colossians as a certainty, not just a potential outcome. That he's saying, if you continue, but I know that you will continue. Your continuing is a given. I'm positive of that. And there are several biblical commentators that corroborate this type of reading. This is going to be a little bit of reading for a second, so you can skim through this if you need to, but this is just several different biblical commentaries and scholars talking about this passage. Starting with the Expositor's Greek Testament, quote, Colossians 1:23, if ye with the indicative expresses the apostles' confidence that the condition will be fulfilled. This abiding in the faith is the only, as it is the sure way, to this presentation of themselves. Reading from the book Paul and Perseverance from Judith Gundry Wolff, quote, nevertheless, Paul does not convey doubt with the words, quote, provided that you continue in the faith, end quote, but suggests that the Colossians will do so, as the indicative mood following L-ye suggests. Reading from Precept Austin, Woost has an excellent note on this section, adding that, quote, the word if here is not in, an unfulfilled hypothetical condition used with the subjunctive mode, presenting the possibility of a future realization, but ei, with the indicative, having here the idea of assuming that you continue in the faith. That is, continuous in the faith as it was preached by Paul would show that the person was saved, and thus would be presented holy, without blemish, and unchargeable before God. That is, Paul was here addressing truly born-again Colossians, not unsaved professors of Christianity who would follow the Colossian heresy. Heretics would not so be presented, only true believers. It is not the retention of salvation that is in the apostles' mind, but the possession of it that would be shown by their continuance in the gospel. Precept Austin also quotes somebody else, Peter O'Brien here, and his paraphrase of the idea as saying, at any rate, if you stand firm in the faith, and I'm sure that you will, as his interpretation of that text. Reading from John Phillips, quote, the word if is used in various ways in the New Testament. The force of the word is always determined by the mood of the verb with which it is used. Two Greek words are used for if. One of them can be followed by a verb in the indicative mood or by a verb in the subjunctive mood. The other can be followed by a verb in either the indicative, the subjunctive, or the optative mood. Here, the word for if can rightly be rendered if so be, and it is followed by a verb in the indicative mood. In other words, there is no doubt about it. We can supply the ellipses. If ye continue in the faith, which you will assuredly do. What we have here then is a definite loyalty. Paul is not casting doubt on our salvation. He is simply saying that a person who is genuinely saved will most assuredly continue in the faith. It is not a question of if you do this or that, you will be saved. It is a question of because you are saved, you will do this or that. So across all these commentators, there is this idea expressed that when Paul says, if you continue in the faith, the verb mood that he is using, this indicative mood for continue, is his way of saying, I'm saying if you continue, but I am confident. I know that you will continue. And so the focus of the passage in this reading, as John Phillips says, is not actually, whether or not you continue, but knowing that given that you are continuing, that you are saved and will be presented as blameless. All of this said, this gives us sort of a clean if-then to investigate, to figure out which interpretation of the text is true. If it is true that the indicative mood of the verb indicates that the conclusion used is a certainty, then Paul is confident. He is certain that the Colossians are going to continue in the faith, that they're not going to stray. And in that way, perhaps his use of the if-then here is kind of an abstract thing. He's using an if-then statement, but he doesn't actually meant for it to be read as conditional because the outcome is confident. It is assured. On the flip side, if the use of the indicative verb does not convey such confidence, if it is not true that the indicative mood of the verb is a clean giveaway to the author's confidence, then we can't attribute such a thought to Paul, and to interpret the phrase as, if you continue, as I know you will, would be a dishonest reading. It would be adding something to the Bible that isn't there. With all of that established, I want to now make my argument. I want to use several verses here, and I want to argue that the use of the indicative verb in Colossians for continue absolutely does not convey that Paul is confident in a specific outcome and treating it as a given in such a way that overrides his if-then statement and in some way no longer makes it a given or conditional, and that it instead just means that Paul is treating something as a fact for the sake of the argument, for the sake of the if-then. And I want to bring up three different verses to focus on this. Again, everything is ESV, and we'll focus on those a bit more. In all three of these verses from the New Testament, one of them is in the Gospels, two of them are in the writings of Paul. There is an if-then statement used. If this, then this. And I want to go through them one by one. Starting with John chapter 8, verses 42, although I think we have a bit on each side of 42 here. And the context is that Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees. They're having a back and forth. Quote, Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me. For I came from God, and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." In this context, Jesus is saying, hey, to the Pharisees, if God were your father, then you would love me. And he goes on to say that their father is not God, their father is the devil, and that they do his desires. In this context, Jesus is not saying that God is their father, or at least not in the way that he's meaning. There's a sense in which God is, everyone's father. But he's using this as a contrast. If God were a father, you would do this, but you do this because the devil is your father. And yet, that verb for were in if God were your father is in that same indicative mood. We can look at it here. If God, the father of you, this is the interlinear, so it's out of our English order. We can find that verb here, and it's in the imperfect indicative active. It is in that same indicative mood that we find Colossians 1:23. And yet, in this passage, I think it's fair to say, Jesus is certainly not saying that God is their father in the context that he means. He is using that as an if-then. If you did this, you would do this. If you were this way, you would do this thing. But you are not that way. You are of your father, the devil. And so in that case, I think using this indicative mood, we see a case where an if-then is used, but that if is not meant to indicate an obvious, a given outcome. Then moving on to Romans 8:13, Paul is speaking to his congregation there. He says, quote, "So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God." All four verbs in this passage are in that indicative mood. When he says that according to the flesh you live, that's present indicative active. If by the Spirit, the deeds of the body, you put to death, that put to death is also in the indicative. In this passage, is Paul saying that they are living according to the flesh and thus will die? I do not think so. I think when he is writing to this congregation, certainly we can't assume the faith and salvation of every individual, but when Paul's writing this, where he says, if you live to the flesh, you'll die. If you kill the flesh, you will live. He is not saying, if you live in the flesh, with the understanding that obviously you are going to live in the flesh. He would absolutely not say that to a congregation. And in the same way, when he says, if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live, is he treating it as assumed that they will live and put to death the deeds of the body? I think he certainly hopes it, but given that he's putting both of these side by side, I think he's just telling them, if you were to do this thing, if you were to live this way, this would be the outcome. But if you were to live this way, this would be the outcome. And in both cases, the use of the indicative mood in both certainly cannot mean that he is treating both outcomes as a given, because he is giving two opposite outcomes. And then finally, we have 1 Corinthians 15, verses 13 and 14. Again, Paul is writing to a specific congregation. Quote, "Now if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain." Every verb in this passage is in that same indicative mood. If we look at that interlinear, every verb you find there is in the present indicative active, has been raised, perfect indicative middle, has been raised, indicative middle or passive. All of them are in that same indicative mood. But certainly, Paul is not saying this to them to say that there is obviously no resurrection of the dead. That is the opposite of what Paul is trying to convey, and yet he uses that indicative mood for those verbs. If we accept the premise that the indicative mood being used for a verb in that if-then framework is used to indicate that the author is treating that end result as a given, that they are confident that is what is going to happen, then we would have to read this passage as saying that Paul thinks that there is no resurrection of the dead and Christ has not been raised. And surely he does not mean that. Absolutely not. He is using this to give them an if-then. He is making an argument to them. If we said that there is no resurrection of the dead, then Jesus was not resurrected. If Christ was not raised, our preaching is in vain. Your faith is in vain. But he is not saying that to them to say that there is no resurrection and that Christ was not raised. He is telling them the exact opposite. You must believe that there was a resurrection of the dead. You must believe that Christ was resurrected. Otherwise, what is your faith built on? Given all of these, given these three passages, I feel confident saying that the indicative mood being used in that if-then framework cannot be intended to mean an absolute, complete confidence that the if they're talking about is going to happen. And given that, that cannot be what it means, or at least that can't be the evidence we use for that meaning in Colossians 1:23. We can't use the indicative mood being used in 1:23 to say if you continue and say, well, it's in the indicative. He must be assuming that they continue. If in these cases in 1 Corinthians and Romans and John, that same indicative mood for those verbs is also used in cases where certainly the author does not mean that if in the if-then is a given. But if that's the case, if I'm right, then why is it being used? Why is that indicative mood there in Colossians 1:23? This is another good place to throw in that disclaimer. I don't know any Greek. I can't speak any of it. I can't read any of it. So again, I'm just going to defer to what other people have said. A lot of this that we're about to go through is from different kind of old scuffed up Greek education things for people learning Greek and Koine Greek. But from what I've seen, it seems to be the case that the indicative is used to grant a starting position from which to make an argument. In Greek, there are apparently 4 different ways to construct a conditional if-then sentence. There's 4 classes. The first class of conditional sentence assumes that the premise is true for the sake of the argument. The second class assumes that the premise is not true for the sake of argument. The third indicates that there is a more probable future condition and then a more general one. And then the fourth class focuses on a less probable future condition. That's a mess. You don't need to internalize any of that. But the important thing is that the use of that first class, where you assume a premise is true for the sake of argument, is indicated by that indicative verb. It's I need to rephrase that. Indicated by the indicative verb is super clumsy, but you understand what I'm saying. According to these, Greek learning pamphlets and everything, you can tell if the first class conditional is used by looking to see if that verb in question is in the indicative. We actually kind of heard some of the earlier authors say something similar, like John Phillips. Given this conclusion, I don't think that there are any grounds to conclude that Paul is exempting the Colossians from his if-then statement, or that his if-then statement is in some way abstract or rhetorical. I think in assuming that the indicative use assumes otherwise clashes with the words of Jesus and then also Paul himself in those other passages that we looked at. And I guess the sort of last stone to lob at somebody who argues otherwise, who argues that this indicative does convey a certainty that the Colossians will continue, is that if you believe that, what I would need to see explained for me is an explanation for these other passages. If that is the case, if that indicative mood is your clue here, your giveaway that the author means a certain thing that doesn't really mesh with the clear reading of the text, the plain text reading, why is it that in John 8 and Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 15, we have these uses of that same clue you're using, that same indicative mood, in passages where the author certainly does not mean that the thing in the if section is assumed to be true? That's the barrier I would need to see jumped. One final note I want to make here that is sort of incidental to this, but when looking through all this and trying to figure it out, I actually found several more passages in the New Testament from different books that also use a very similar structure to Colossians 1:23 and seem to have a very similar meaning. I'm just going to read through them very quickly. We're not going to focus on it too much, but I don't think you can say that Colossians 1:23 is an isolated incident. I think that there are several other verses that seem to mean several similar things and use a similar if-then structure. Starting with Hebrews chapter 3, verse 6, Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. So we are his house if indeed we hold fast to our confidence. And I want to note that in this passage, the verb for hold fast, if indeed we hold fast, which is sort of the analogous or correlative part to the if we continue in Colossians 1:23, that verb is not in the indicative mood at all. So even if the indicative mood did convey that absolute confidence, here we have a similar passage with seemingly a similar meaning that doesn't use that indicative. It uses the subjunctive. And just to pull really quickly from that interlinear, if we hold is in the aorist subjunctive active. So we don't even have that indicative mood use. And then very shortly down in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 14, quote, "But exhort one another every day as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end." And again, this verb for hold is in the subjunctive, not the indicative. And this seems to be a passage that has a similar meaning. We have come to share in Christ if we hold our confidence firm to the end. And then one more I wanted to note here, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 and 2. "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain." In all three of these verses, I see something that to me reads as very similar to the meaning I'm gleaning from Colossians 1:23, that you are saved if you continue in your original confidence, in your original belief, if you believed and it was not in vain. And then I want to note that because I think that's relevant to the discussion broadly. And then finally, there's an article that I found from a biblical scholar where he talks about this whole issue and the interpretation of it. It's a long article and it's very wordy, but I found it very interesting and it was helpful for me to find sort of sources and sort of ground my framework in this. So that's linked in this document. And then this document is linked in the description of this video. So anything you see, especially any of this blue linked text, all of this is stuff you can find and check out for yourself if you have any questions or want to see sort of how I reached a certain conclusion. But that is it. That's all the thoughts I have on it. This has been very, very fun to look into. I stayed up way too late last night pulling it together, and I hope it's useful and enjoyable.